to the Trust Your Gut podcast. We have a really amazing guest here today, Kenji Morimoto.
Hello, Hannah. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited for this conversation.
Me too. Well, you have this beautiful new book called Ferment. This is the US version that I'm holding here, and we are doing a giveaway, so stay tuned and you'll get more details on how you might be able to win your own copy. But first, let's just dive into your background, Kenji. So you're a fermenter. How did you grew up with this? You fell into it? Yeah, give us a little bit of your story.
Of course, yeah, very good question. Yeah, so I'm sure you can tell from my name, Kenji Morimoto. I'm ethnically Japanese, born and raised in Chicago. But essentially, as probably a lot of people know with Japanese food, fermentation plays a large part of it, right? A lot of those flavors, everything from soy sauce to miso, rice vinegar, wine, etc. So those flavors were very, forward, were very front of mind for me throughout my life. But honestly, I don't want to say I fell into pickling since it was very much my choice, but, I think with a lot of immigrant households and a lot of families, right, food is at the center of what you do. It's community, it's being together, it's, everyone knowing their roles in a kitchen. And no one made pickles. So I kind of fell into that. I think for my parents and grandparents, I think my grandparents were kind of like, well, we can buy great Japanese pickles at our Japanese grocery stores, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, it was, very low cost, right? Cabbages, carrots, cucumbers. And, for me, it was just something honestly very magical as a child, right? Kind of seeing how you could take pretty cheap, normal vegetables, apply salt, acid in the form of vinegar or citrus, and essentially manipulate, the textures, the flavors. And I think as a, weird kid, that was really cool, right? That you could literally, I really felt you were performing magic. I'm quite witchy. So, I think, it's just it was something very cool like that. So I just kind of fell into it. And I think, as a child, that kind of just lit a passion of the manipulation of vegetables and kind of what pickling and preservation and, what fermentation can be. And those kind of initial memories and kind of how I was as a child just kind of stuck with me. I've always been, as many people say, a passionate home cook. I've always been a pretty intense cook. But, I've always viewed fermentation and preservation to be uniquely special within the realm of all food stuff. Something I always say is that, regardless of where we're from, be it anywhere in the world, we've all preserved. That's how our families survived and thrived, and through that created an amazing culinary legacy that we can now really pursue. Thanks to social media, thanks, just the fact that we are connecting these global traditions. So that's kind of how I fell into it, just kind of, part of my heritage, but also kind of a precocious child who wanted to be in the kitchen. But again, what fermentation and preservation can really symbolize to us as, dare I say, as a human race, I think is so special, since again, it is so uniquely universal. And I think also the memories that fermentation and preservations can carry are unique within the food world, right? Because they're so intrinsic to us as being humans.
Well, they're really in our DNA, and I'm from Chicago too.
Woo, woo, are you? I didn't know that. Whereabouts are you from?
Skokie. It's a
I'm
north
from I'm from Evanston.
What? We're basically neighbors.
We are, like my favorite bagel. My family's favorite bagel place is in Skokie. Yeah,
of course it is.
Of course it is. Oh, that's so funny. You're from Skokie. Yeah, I'm from Evanston, born and raised.
Well, and I worked at Caffeine, like one of the first cool coffee shops in Evanston before.
Yes. Oh,
I'm probably
so
a little
funny.
bit older than you are, though, Kenji.
But still, like, wow. Again, I love how small this world can be.
Well, and so my first love was pickles, but we didn't really make them. My mom would make fridge cucumbers. I guess those would be sort of fridge pickles. But we were sad. So we were more standard American diet. We didn't have this great culinary background to pull from, unfortunately. And so I learned fermentation much later in life. So I'm like imagining you in the kitchen. Are you 3? Are you 8? Are you 15? Like, you starting to get curious?
I want to say it was probably maybe 8, 9. I think I was maybe 9 or 10 years old when I saved all my money to buy a Japanese pickle press.
Ooh.
It's not that exciting. It's kind of cool. It's just like this plastic press where you essentially put pressure on vegetables, right? With like a screw mechanism. So yeah, I think, I was quite a crafty kid. So I think, it's just fun to play with food. And, I think anyone who's creative, I think can really view food as being kind of one of the ultimate forms of kind of showing that creativity, because it's not just, you know, how you play with flavors, but it's also colors and textures, but then also the ability to feed people, right? And I think that's just the kind of the icing on the cake, as they say. But yeah, no, so I was pretty young when I started doing it. But again, these were Japanese pickles, so not probably dissimilar to kind of, you know, quote unquote easy pickles,
So
right?
like rice vinegar, garlic.
Exactly. So a lot of them were kind of, you know, rice vinegar based or just salt based. Not really long-term ferments. They were all kind of Japanese, they're called asazuke, so kind of quick pickles, or shallow pickling. Yeah, so most of them were quite easy. But actually, it wasn't until I went away to it wasn't until after university that I started to really ferment in earnest, kind of making kimchi when I first lived in India. And also, you might recall this when I talk about this in my kombucha chapter, but also accidentally kind of making pellicles and scobies in my kind of warm, it sounds really nasty if you kind of reflect on it, but leaving like, you know, quarter filled jars of kombucha, because I was obsessed with kombucha at university, just kind of leaving it in my room and being like, oh, what is this, you know, gross phlegm-like looking stuff, not really realizing exactly that I was seeing fermentation in real time. But that was before I really got into making kombucha, when I was like, I wasn't making it at university. But yeah, it's just always fun to reflect on those different inflection points, and how they really inform your experience and what you become.
Well, and like you, my thirst outgrew my budget. You know, I didn't have my first sip of kombucha until 2003. So it was much later in life, and a long time ago now. But I too enjoyed those expensive bottles of kombucha.
I know. I mean, there was something
to have the mother in them, and I can remember the first time I took my sip and it touched my lips. I almost did a spit take right there in the store because I was like, "Oh, what is that?"
Oh, 100%, right? And obviously now I drink that with glee. But you know, it's, you know, exactly.
Like, down the hatch.
No, completely. But I think, you know, it just, you know, I think oftentimes we think that food trends and, you know, things change so slowly, but it is a man, obviously 20 years ago is a while ago now, but similarly, right? That's kind of when I started to drink kombucha. And yeah, completely. You know, I think I love seeing that it was all proper kombucha too, which I really love. Kind of what I'm imagining, some of those initial brands that really hit the U.S. market. Yeah, I think, you know, it was all amazing, and again, it was delicious stuff, before it really got commercialized, into how it is in 2025.
Well, and there's so many different types of kombucha now and different ways in which they process it. And this is sort of what we saw with yogurt, where yogurt used to be this very culturally diverse product. It gets commercialized, it gets distilled down to 3 or 4 organisms. And sure, there's benefit to that, but it's not the same as when you're making your own milk kefir or yogurt and how many different strains you have with that. So there is that balance between commercializing, and by the same token, can we make every ferment ourselves? Like, how many ferments do you have going in your kitchen?
Oh, way too many. But again, but that's what I tell people, right? I'm sure you're in a similar vein, right? I think I always say, make what you actually will like.
Yes.
Because, you know, not everyone, you know, as much as I love kombucha, not everyone loves it, right? And I often, you hear stories of people being, okay, they want to start making kombucha, and then fast forward, they're stuck with gallons and gallons of it that have all gotten over fermented, and then they give up because it's too much for them. You know, but I think, you know, with kombucha, I mean, I think, you know, luckily there are amazing brands out there, that are great. I mean, obviously it can be expensive, but, you know, there's a lot of accessible ones. But I think kombucha is one particular ferment in my mind that there's a lot to be said about making it at home. Because not just the flavors, but, you know, what I always say with ferments is that every ferment, be it a kombucha, be it a lacto ferment, they all have a life cycle. Right, you might actually like I personally like quite vinegary from kombucha after the F1, right? Without it being flavored, I actually like quite I don't even care for it too much when it's really bubbly. I like it really still.
Right. You like it more in the vinegar phase, sort of the traditional tonic that maybe the Russian babushka ladies were drinking, or
exactly. Or, you know, I tell people, you know, mix it with soda water, right? If you want to dilute it, make it into a non-alcoholic or alcoholic cocktail. There's so many ways to play around with it. And I think that's why it's important to view all ferments, but kombucha, again, specifically, as a life cycle. You might like it earlier when it's a bit, again, fresher or sweeter. I like a bit more sour. But you also might want to drink it in different ways and actually treat it like an ingredient versus just a drink.
Which is honestly, like, I have milk kefir in my fridge, and I call myself a lazy fermenter because I just leave it there. Now I don't drink the milk kefir, but I make milk kefir pancakes. I
Mm.
brine chicken in it. And so for me, it's this like forever milk kefir. I top it off with milk every once in a while. It's just I don't have a habit of drinking a lot of milk. So
Yeah.
I'm not keeping that around. But I have this sort of lazy ferment like you're talking about. If I tried to drink it, it'd probably like blow my socks off. But it's great for the uses I have it
Yeah,
for.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, that's another thing that I really try to press on people that, you know, I think in 2025, we view everything as like, having one purpose, or, it's an ingredient that must be used as such in very prescripted ways.
Mm-hmm.
But again, case in point, you're actually not making milk kefir to drink it. You're using it for a host of other reasons, which again, within the home setting, which obviously requires not just knowledge, but confidence as well. But again, with all fermentation, as you know, 'cause I would say, like, I probably shouldn't say this too openly, but I would agree, like, I'm quite lazy too. Like, the number of ferments that I neglect like no other. But but again, it's not always a bad thing, because you might discover that, ooh, that pickle in 2 months was gross, but fast forward 6 months, maybe it's become something beautiful. Or maybe at that point you cook with it, or maybe at that point you dehydrate it, or use it to maybe even like flavor potentially an F2 of a kombucha when you're adding those other forms of flavors or sugars to something. So I often say, like, fermentation, just like cooking, is like you have so much agency, because you're deciding when something is done as well as something is used. Unlike, say, a normal cookbook where it's, here's the recipe, here's what you must do. With fermentation, it's all ranges based on if you're fermenting in the middle of the winter, summer. Again, all this, but I think that can be challenging sometimes to like the quote unquote normal consumer.
1000%, because they want this prescriptive. Well, okay, well, what's the one way I do it? How do I know it's ready? What these are all the fear-based questions we get. Like, oh, did I do something wrong? Oh, something's growing in it. I'm like, well, it's supposed to. And so, but your point is well taken in that there is a freedom and flexibility with fermentation that we don't have with fresh food.
I agree. Yeah.
Confused with processed food because, like, oh, well, the shelf life is this, or do I have to store it in the fridge? Well, you don't keep your vinegar in the fridge. You can keep it at room temperature. So
exactly.
It is an invitation to play. And I love that it's like one of the oldest ways in which we preserve foods, and it's been with us this whole time. So I feel like whether you grew up fermenting or not, somewhere in your DNA is you're coded to crave, desire, love, and really anyone can figure out fermentation. So I mean, you describe yourself as a third culture cook, right? Someone who's between worlds. You just talked about kimchi in India.
Yeah.
You're from Chicago, you live in London now, and I'm sure you've traveled many different places. Like, how has that in between space shaped your relationship with food and fermentation?
That's a really good question, and it's actually quite funny. I'm so ethnically Japanese, born and raised in America, living in London, but actually I'm currently in Vietnam, hence the challenges with the time difference. Because my partner is based here, so I'm spending some time here. But yeah, I mean, I think the in-betweens is what makes this world wonderful. And I think the in-betweens also is because if you think, like, I think if you asked me 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I think I'd be someone who might gatekeep a bit, in terms of what food traditions can be or are. Not even like, touching on, appropriation or anything, but just, I probably would have been more gatekeepy as a, rambunctious teenager. But I think, all the best food, all the best ideas are a result of a confluence of cultures, are a result of, ideas and people coming together. As well as, dare I say, scarcity and accessibility, right? I think I always give the example of, so I'm ethnically Japanese, right? Tonkatsu, right? Everyone knows what tonkatsu is, right? Deep fried pork, right? With panko. I would view that as being very Japanese, but actually that was, introduced from the Portuguese, both in terms of deep frying as well as kind of the consumption of pork. Which, was relatively recent in the grand history of a country. So, and I think, what is considered authentic or of a culture is a sliding timescale. And again, it's a reflection of, obviously people coming together, ideas, ingredients, etc., interacting. So for me, because again, I'm very attuned to my own like family's immigrant history and story, especially in the US, I've always really thought about, how again, scarcity or accessibility kind of has informed not only what you eat, but what you crave and how you decide to recreate those recipes at home. There's this one family recipe, which actually I've never really spoken too much about. There's a Japanese ferment called nukazuke, which is it's a lacto ferment where you use traditionally rice bran. So, a byproduct of processing rice. You create a lactic bed. So pretty standard lacto fermentation, but you essentially add salt water to rice bran, and then it becomes just like a bed that you ferment vegetables in. Very traditional Japanese. When my grandparents, after the war, once the camps were over, when they kind of relocated to Chicago, my maternal grandfather started making that with Quaker oats, right? Because he couldn't find rice bran, but obviously, Chicago in the mid 1940s, early 50s, you could buy, obviously, oats were really common, and he recreated that recipe. The flavors are very similar, the process is identical, but in my mind, that's wonderful, right? Essentially, how do you recreate these flavors at home when the ingredients that are home aren't there for you? And of course, in 2025, we can get whatever we want. That's hashtag globalization. Right. But I think the more that we can really think about what's local to us, how can we use what's around us and recreate that, you're going to be making something wonderful. But I think so often we are really stuck on what things have to be without actually diving into what they can be with, again, creativity and just some, connecting of dots.
Well, but I think you're hitting an important point, which is knowing the rules allows you to then break them, right? So somebody said this, right? Like you learn the rules and then you break them. And so there's value, I think, in understanding like that earlier self of yours that wanted to be more gatekeeper. No, this is the way we do it, right? We mellow with age, just like our
exactly. Yeah.
And so, but there is value in understanding. So what is the way that you traditionally make the namazuke? And then now how can we creatively insert local ingredients or different things because we don't have access to rice bran or whatever the case may be. And so I think what that allows is for fermentation, I think, is one of the most beautiful canvases. Kombucha, water kefir, any of these ferment, even sauerkraut, like what you put into it for those additives, that's where your flair, this is where your personal flavor gets to shine through, and what's local, what's in season. That's why I love encouraging people, go to your farmer's market, find what there's too much of, there's too many ingredients, well, find something to do with them. So
100%, so many people ask me like, oh, should I only be buying, organic? Should I only be doing X, Y, Z? And like my honest answer is like so many of my best ideas are I go to the discounted veg section in my big grocery store, or I go to the farmer's market and see what clearly there's a surplus of. That should be the source of inspiration, right? Yeah. And I think when you pivot it that way, again, it's that increased awareness, I think, not just of seasonality, but again, the agency that you are bringing into how you consume food, right? Because obviously we live in this world where there's so many capitalistic food structures, which I won't comment too much on. But, I think the more that we can engage with the local and again, have that inform the decisions and also our purchasing decisions, the more power we're bringing to ourselves. And I think just sadly in 2025, we lack agency at times. So again, here's one small way. I don't want to say it's like radical, but a small radical way that you can really do that for yourself, your families, and again, what you're trying to create for yourself.
Well, I think what's radical about it is you're stepping outside of the processed food paradigm and saying, I have faith because this has been going on for so many thousands of years that if I take this, vegetable from that part of the supermarket or whatever, that I'm going to be able to create something that's nutritious, that's probably even more nutritious than what you're getting in a processed food setting anyways. And, with this in Ferment, you share recipes that are both global, they're also deeply personal, but you had to cut some of them, right? So how did you decide which recipes made it in and which ones maybe didn't quite get in?
Yeah, it was a hard one. I mean, was it hard? It's funny. So, I mean, I think I'm an omnivore. I eat everything, but it was funny. Like I've realized that as I've gotten older, especially how I like to cook at home, it does lean more plant-based. Not vegan, but I think just like I like cooking vegetables.
Yeah.
I think personally as a home cook / chef, I just feel like vegetables are fascinating. You can do so much with them. The humble the humble cabbage, the humble zucchini. You can manipulate so much, and it's fascinating. So it's actually quite funny. When I first sent in one of my earlier drafts, my publisher was like, oh, we need to include a bit more meat, since it was very much leaning vegetarian, and I didn't want it to be, labeled as a vegetarian cookbook. But honestly, a lot of my inspiration for this cookbook was, honestly, what do I like to cook? I wasn't necessarily really trying to fit a brief, per se, of like, X amount of this or that. I think one thing that was a bit challenging was where do I draw the line in terms of what ferments to include?
Yeah.
As well as how, dare I say, how do you find that balance of accessibility? Because ultimately, I do think this is an incredibly beginner-friendly book. But then also, how do you maintain interest for those who actually are passionate fermenters, who might be an expert at kombucha or an expert at, all ferment? I don't think anyone's an expert at all ferments, but how do you find that balance? So it was, I think, really drafting out all the recipes, but then also, and this is kind of the annoying thing about book publishing at times, what do I think, whilst I might like a recipe, what will actually be commercial?
Right.
What do I think people will actually make? So, there were some recipes that may have been a bit more complex, or maybe might include a bit, you might need to go to a specialty grocery store, too many, one or too many times to actually do the recipe correctly. So it's also finding that balance.
Is there a favorite recipe? Like, is there one recipe that you're like, oh my God, I love this so much?
I mean, I love to deep fry. I think it's one of the best ways of cooking. So I think one really good recipe is my kimchi bhaji, which is kind of like a kimchi pakora. With like a miso, coriander, cilantro, mint chutney. And I love that, number one, because I love to deep fry. I think it's great. It's, for me, because I enjoy storytelling, I enjoy writing. So, for me, that was a very, I don't want to say it was a very personal recipe, but it was personal to that. It kind of celebrated my arrival in London, where bhajis, traditionally onion bhajis, are very common in every South Asian restaurant. Again, similar to pakoras. As well as kind of a celebration of, hey, I moved to London, I'm settling a bit, now it's time to start fermenting.
Oh, so this wasn't even something you developed in India?
No. This was very much kind of me moving to, and obviously amazing South Asian food in London. I hadn't really had the onion bhaji, which is the very common dish in the UK. And that also kind of happened at the same time as me starting to make kimchi quite a lot in London, because when I moved there back in 2016, there wasn't that much kimchi on the market, and what there was either wasn't very good or very expensive. And given just the amount of kimchi that I consume, I just started to make it. But the other reason why I really like this recipe is that because so many people tell me, okay, great, I fermented something, how do I eat it? Or what do I do? What's next? And again, the easy answer is eat it with everything.
Put it in your mouth.
Exactly. You try it, you decide how you want to eat it. But I think what's nice about, as you definitely know, obviously, when you cook with a ferment, yes, it does kill the good bacteria. However, what you're left with are heaps of flavor. As well as, again, as I said earlier, I view all ferments and, pickles and things as having a life cycle. Me personally, I really like fresh kimchi. I like when it has a bit more of a crunch, a texture, not as yeasty. But when you over ferment it, that's when it's prime for cooking with. So I always say that, if you're new to making kimchi, make some, eat some fresh, try it regular, try little, try often is what I say. But then also keep some at room temperature for a long time. Obviously make sure it's safe, follow the best practices. But what you'll find is, yes, it might disintegrate. Yes, the texture will change. It might get a bit yeasty, it could get funky, but then cook with it. Because the flavors that will be imparted on whatever dish you make, there's a reason in Korea, right? They love kimchi fried rice, or not even just Korea, in the West, kimchi pancakes, kimchi tofu stews. It's because like when you cook with it, it transforms entirely. So I feel like the kimchi bhaji recipe just encapsulates a lot of my ethos with kind of how to treat a fermented ingredient, as well as kind of, again, going back to your earlier question, my experience as a quote unquote third culture cook and third culture adult, kind of how these different ideas inform who I am and what I like to create.
That sounds so good. And, we've been talking about fermentation as this sort of having patience. Sometimes we have to wait a long time for something to be ready, or like you're saying, we're tasting it at different stages. as a metaphor, like how has working with microbes taught you about yourself? What have you been able to learn or reflect?
That's a great question. So I talk a little bit about this in my miso chapter, but so I'm Buddhist, raised Buddhist. I would still identify as being Buddhist, Japanese American Buddhist, and it was really through fermentation, particularly during the pandemic, that I really was able to reappreciate and frame my Buddhism. So dare I say, the microbes have taught me a lot about kind of, I don't want to say spirituality per se, but, in terms of how I view my life, the actions I take, as well as what ferments can teach me, as well as kind of the microbes and their action about life. And what I mean by that is, so, obviously during the pandemic, the world was big question mark as to what was happening. In the UK, the lockdown, there were pretty legitimate lockdowns happening. I didn't see my family for a while in the US. And, there was something so comforting every evening, once my dogs were kind of, snoozing away, my husband was asleep, and I was just kind of, in the kitchen, like observing the jars, seeing what was happening, being aware of that, but also being able to course correct if needed. And especially with miso, and again, this is obviously true for a lot of ferments, the microbes on your hands around you become part of the product, become part of what's in the jar. And I think there's something so beautiful about what fermentation can teach you about kind of mental health, again, and that's how I align it to Buddhism, in terms of that awareness in what you're doing. Kind of, like almost like when you're doing like a yoga class or like an intense workout. In that moment, you're focusing on that action entirely, be it chopping cabbage, be it massaging, be it, tinkering with your bottles for kombucha, but you're so kind of overtaken by what's happening. But then once you do that, you have to trust the process, right? You need to believe that you need to believe, and I feel like that's often a big roadblock for people, not believing it'll work. Right. But you believe it's going to happen, but also it kind of moves in parallel to the rest of you, right? That, with all your best intent, hopefully you've made something wonderful and it will work out well. But a lot of that is believing and, trusting the process and, almost like letting go, right? Kind of separating yourself.
The surrender. Exactly.
Exactly, right? And I think there's something so cool about, again, I often talk about the craziness of 2025 and just, how modern life is. But there's something so nice about being kind of dictated or kind of living to the drum, during the pandemic of like a sourdough starter, everyone was making sourdough, but, living to the beat of the jars in your kitchen, almost like, using, making like, and just kind of having that be a parallel to how you develop as well. I often share the story that, and I mentioned this in my miso chapter, the first time I saw my parents after the pandemic, when they were able to come to London, we made miso together. My parents had never made miso. I think they obviously support and love what I do, but they don't really ferment. But we sat around in my kitchen, mashing soybeans, mashing rice koji together. And there was something so beautiful in that moment of us all coming together, like, dare I say, like an act of communion, just like putting our hands together, mashing the microbes on our hands, becoming one product, a jar of it going back to my parents to Chicago, a jar of it staying in London. And what a great snapshot of that moment, of what it is. But then again, it will develop kind of as the microbes do their thing, parallel to our own growth and development as people. And I just love that so much. Like, again, obviously cooking is important and I love cooking, but again, you can't say the same thing about cooking.
Right.
There's something so unique to what preservation is, not just in the act and what the microbes do, which again have been around for forever, but also, again, the stories that those carry and the memories that they inevitably will hold as time progresses.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, I think what fermentation has taught me is process and patience, because so much of our society is marketed towards fast, instant gratification. Our attention spans have dwindled to, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. So engaging in a practice where it's going to take time, where, like you said, you're putting yourself, literally your hands, whatever tools, implements you're using, and then you're waiting. And you're seeing how it develops. And by the time you then enjoy that product, you have changed. It has changed. You consume it, it changes you even more. And so I really do think of fermentation as a very sacred act, as something that I'm not saying you can't have music on or, everything has to be so reverent, but there is a moment in every time I'm making a ferment where I pause and I thank the microbes and I appreciate that interplay. And I think of them as magic, because a really good magic trick is when you cannot see what is being done. And
I
cannot
love that.
see these microbes, and yet they're doing these amazing things. And so I think of microbes as magic.
Yeah.
And their life. Like you said, I love going in and hearing the jars just like burble,
Oh,
like
yeah.
settle, or like the bubbles go boop, boop. And I'm like, oh, they're talking to me.
No, completely, right? And again, I think we're just so attuned to 15-minute food deliveries and 10-minute meals. And again, I appreciate many of us are incredibly busy, and it does require obviously a pivot in how you view how you want to live your life to ferment. But again, it's just there's something so, again, I think I reckon we're probably similar in many ways. But there's something so wonderful being surrounded by live things.
Yes.
Right. And also just being aware of that it's not just you. Right. It's not just humans who are calling the shots and everything.
Right.
It's being surrounded by plants. It's being surrounded by life, by sounds. And again, I just love, obviously you don't want an exploding jar anytime, but again, I just love, hearing the carbon dioxide. I love hearing gases, the hissing from a jar of anything from kombucha to sauerkraut.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and whilst I think for a lot of people that can be scary, it's no, things are working. And again, those are the same signs that our ancestors were looking for as well. Right? They didn't have pH meters. They didn't have even scales right? They were just trusting their own senses and the intuition that was, passed down from grandmother to grandchild. And, I think it's just so universal, which is why I think it's, again, really beautiful and to your point, magical.
Yeah. Well, and you've built a community online that's both curious and kind. What have you learned about sharing your passion for fermentation with such a broad audience, and how has that shaped you?
I love it. I really do. As much as I hate social media, I love it. I think I think everyone who even touches social media will agree to that. But I think for me, because, my pursuit of fermentation, has never really been through a scientific lens. It's always been through the pursuit of flavor, as well as kind of the pursuit of the stories that we share and how we connect. So for me, I've done a few seasons of something like my Easy Japanese Pickle series, where I just kind of reflect on and recreate tsukemono, so Japanese pickles, using kind of different ingredients or kind of just easy techniques. But I think that's a really good example in that, I just, especially when and I think my first series was back at the beginning of 2024. And just hearing the stories from people throughout particularly the Japanese diaspora, because obviously it's Japanese pickles, from California to South America to Japan to throughout Southeast Asia, just being like, oh, wow, I haven't thought about that since my grandmother died. Or wow, my great uncle used to make something like that. Or wow, just thank you. And again, I'm not doing this to get thanks from people. Again, life is so speedy. Our memory is so short as people. So again, I really just love unearthing these stories and what they can mean for people.
Mm-hmm.
I think another good example is I do a good amount of kind of South Asian ferments and pickles. And one that I did that I guess went quote unquote viral was something called kanji, which is essentially, it's not dissimilar to kvass. So it uses beetroot or carrots. It's a lacto brine that's heavily flavored, delicious, a great shot in the morning, really gets you up in the morning. But even that, most of the engagement was from India. Many people had either never heard of it, or again were recounting stories of grandmothers or kind of people who passed away making that. And I just love that, because again, I think the more that we can be attuned to where we not just come from, but again, the stories and the food techniques. I think that's so integral to us.
Well, that's the tapestry of life, like these threads where, if you look at one life, it's a very short thread. But if you have that through line where, even if it skips a generation or whatnot, but you're able to be like, oh, grandma did this, or this is something that, extends backward, that's where that beautiful thread is able to weave its way through.
Completely. Yeah. And I think also
flavors are such a memory, right? They lock in a memory, smells and flavors. They take you literally back to that place when you first experienced it. And so it's just such a powerful way, like you're talking about, to encapsulate story, to encapsulate relationship and connection.
Yeah, and I often say, like obviously, we all have early food memories, but I often say, like, I often challenge people in that I think if we dive a bit deeper, I think our earliest food memories are often ones surrounding some level of preservation. And what I mean by that is think about like, a sour dill pickle that maybe, the crunch of it, or, maybe the tang of a vinegar, or, a salty fermented black bean, kind of the flavors that we hated as kids, but that we grew to love. Or even the memories of, mason jars gathering dust in grandparents' pantries that look spooky, and but like those are such powerful memories. And again, it's not just a coincidence that as we get older, we want to recreate that as we have a bit more perspective on life, as we obviously maybe lose grandparents or elders. We want to recreate that, not just because I think really it means something to us as humans, but also those flavors are, again, to what we were saying earlier, just so integral to us as our own human development. Those weird flavors that we now love. So I often think, people obviously have old food memories, but I want to say that they're often tied to something preserved in some form.
Well, preservation is preservation, right? Preservation is saving those memories and storing more than just food, but tradition and community.
Yeah.
So if you could pass down one living lesson, a taste, a practice, a philosophy to the next generation of fermenters, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a really, really good question. I mean, okay, my answer is going to be quite maybe perhaps basic, but I think it's really trust the process, right? I know it's like that's quite like an open, broad statement, but I think again, we like to set ourselves up for failure. I think we're really conditioned to look for things to go wrong. But what I always tell people is that a lot of fermentation throughout the world historically was all done in open vats, right? Probably covered in yeast, covered in mold.
And fruit flies.
Exactly. And again, fruit flies, another topic, horrible, but hey, part of the process. But I think I always like to remind people that, again, our ancestors did this, so can we. A lot of books I know obviously kind of angle it more towards a scientific, almost lab-like setup. But again, our foreparents didn't have any of that, right? Again, it was listening, it was seeing, it was tasting. So just believe that it'll work. And also, as a part of that, as animals, as humans, we are very resilient, right? What I always say, like if it smells, tastes, and looks bad, then probably throw it out. But if it doesn't, then again, the microbes want to survive, right? If you create the right environment, they will not just survive, they'll thrive. But you need to believe that. So trust the process, especially if you are new to fermenting anything. Because again, so often, we will sabotage ourselves before we even start it. So why not just give it a go? And just believe that it'll work. And if it does, amazing. And if it doesn't, even so, that's okay. Because, if you're new to something, so much of it's learning about what works in your own environment. So even if you make your first batch of kombucha or sauerkraut or kimchi or miso and it fails, that's not a bad thing. You've learned what to do differently for the next time you do it in your home kitchen. Maybe it was a function of temperature. When you did it, maybe it was you were maybe a bit too greedy and ate too much as it was going in and out, as with the same fork and introduced new bacteria, right? But again, it's all a learning process.
Well, what I hear in that is trust yourself. Trust your humanity, trust your senses, which is something that I think we've been trained to only trust visual or only trust audio. And we don't rely on smell and taste as much as we used to, especially when we're over consuming processed foods. Our tongues can't even taste or perceive the flavors of fermentation without recoiling because our receptors are coated in gunk. And, and that's the great thing about ferments is it's going to clear that out pretty quick.
Exactly.
But I love that because it is just a reminder, like, trust your humanity. Like, this is who we are. This is where we come from. And this is such an easy way to reconnect to that aspect of yourself, especially in such an artificial, contrived world that we live in. And
110%. Couldn't agree with you more.
Oh my God, I feel like we can talk forever, Kenji.
I know. This has been really lovely.
Well, tell people how they can find you if they haven't already. And yes, we will be giving away your book. We'll share more details about that when we release the podcast. So stay tuned. But where can people find it?
So I'm probably most I am most active on my Instagram, which is Kenj Cooks without an I, so Kenj Cooks. I also have a website, which is kind of a work in progress, but most of my new recipes are there, which is just kenjcooks.com. And my book is available wherever books are sold.
Great. Well, we'll include all that info in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your enthusiasm and love of fermentation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Hannah. This has been a lot of fun, and it's great to meet another nearby Chicagoan.
Chicagoan.
Exactly. Cool. Well, thanks again, Hannah.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.